The snow fell heavy against the frosted windows of the old McKenna house that December evening in 1927, each flake catching the amber light of the kerosene lamp like tiny dancers in the darkness. 12-year-old Billy McKenna pressed his face against the cold glass, watching the storm rage across the Wyoming plains that stretched endlessly beyond the porch. The wind howled through the eaves with a voice he'd grown to know well during his 3 months staying with his grandfather. "Storm's getting worse, Grandpa Tom," Billy said, turning from the window to where his grandfather sat in the worn leather chair by the fireplace. Thomas McKenna, now 85 years old, his once powerful frame, bent but not broken by the weight of decades, stared into the dancing flames with eyes that held memories deeper than the boy could imagine. The old man's weathered hands, marked by countless years of ranch work, rested on the arms of his chair. Those hands had delivered calves in frozen barns, mended fences that stretched for miles, and held the woman whose photograph sat on the mantelpiece above the fire. The sepia-toned portrait showed a couple on their wedding day, the man recognizable as a younger, stronger version of Tom McKenna, standing beside a woman whose eyes held both gentleness and fierce determination. Billy had noticed his grandfather looking at that photograph more often lately, especially when the winter storms came. There was something in the old man's expression during these moments that the boy couldn't quite understand, a mixture of joy and sorrow that seemed to deepen with each passing snowflake. "Tell me about her again, Grandpa Tom," Billy said, settling cross-legged on the worn rug beside his grandfather's chair. "About Grandma Grace." Tom McKenna's eyes shifted from the flames to the photograph, then down to his grandson's eager face. The boy had his grandmother's eyes, Tom noticed, that same spark of curiosity and compassion that had first drawn him to Grace Sullivan all those years ago. He reached over and ruffled Billy's sandy hair, feeling the weight of memory settling over him like a familiar blanket. "Well now," Tom said, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of age but still strong, with the authority of a man who had commanded respect across these plains for over 40 years. "I suppose I could tell you about the winter she saved Christmas." Billy's eyes widened with interest. His grandfather had mentioned this story before, but had never told it in full, always seeming to drift off into private thoughts whenever the boy pressed for details. Tonight, however, something was different. Perhaps it was the storm outside, so similar to the one that had brought Grace Sullivan to his door 42 years ago, or perhaps it was simply time for the boy to hear the truth about love, loss, and the kind of courage that could save more than just a dying calf. Tom settled back in his chair, his gaze returning to the flames as his mind traveled backward through the decades to that December night in 1885 when he had been a different man entirely. A man hollowed out by grief, hardened by loss, and convinced that the best parts of his life lay buried in the Pine Ridge Cemetery alongside his wife Margaret and their infant daughter, Sarah. "It was December 1885, Tom began, his voice taking on the measured cadence of a practiced storyteller. "I was 43 years old then, Billy, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about suffering. Your grandmother Margaret and little Sarah had been gone 3 years by then, taken by the diphtheria that swept through these parts like wildfire. I was running Pine Ridge Ranch with 4 good men, but I was running it like a ghost, going through the motions of living without really being alive." The wind outside seemed to quiet, as if the very elements were listening to the old man's tale. Billy leaned forward, captivated by the change in his grandfather's voice, the way it seemed to grow stronger as he reached back into the past. "The snow was falling just like tonight," Tom continued, "but I wasn't sitting by a warm fire with good company. I was standing in a cold barn, looking down at a newborn calf that was dying, and thinking that maybe it was fitting. Everything I touched seemed to wither and die in those days." Tom McKenna closed his eyes, and suddenly he wasn't an old man in a chair, but a grief-stricken widower standing in the bitter cold of a Wyoming winter, watching his hopes slip away one breath at a time. Pine Ridge Ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of Wyoming territory, its boundaries marked by fence posts that disappeared into the white expanse of the December storm. The main house, built of logs and stone, sat solid against the wind, but it was the barn that served as the heart of the operation. Built to withstand the brutal winters of the high plains, its thick walls and heavy doors provided shelter for the animals that represented not just Tom McKenna's livelihood, but his last chance at financial survival. Tom stood in the lamplight, staring down at the newborn calf that lay shivering in a bed of fresh straw. The barn around him held the familiar sense of hay, leather, and animal warmth. But tonight even these comforting smells couldn't ease the weight pressing down on his shoulders. The calf's mother, a prize Holstein named Duchess, lay still in the stall beside them. She had died 2 hours earlier from complications that Dr. Tom Harrison had warned might happen with a cow of her age attempting to carry twins. Only one calf had survived the difficult birth, and now even that single survivor seemed determined to follow its mother into death. Born a week premature in the worst blizzard of the winter, the small creature fought for each breath. Its ribs showed too clearly beneath its damp hide, and its eyes held the dull glaze of an animal already halfway to wherever animals went when their struggles ended. Tom knelt beside the calf, his knees creaking in protest against the cold barn floor. At 43, he was no longer the young man who had first claimed this land 20 years ago. The years since Margaret and Sarah's death had aged him in ways that went beyond the calendar. His dark hair now showed threads of silver, and the lines around his eyes spoke of too many sleepless nights and too many difficult decisions made alone. "Come on, little one," Tom murmured, running his calloused hands along the calf's ribs. The animal's heartbeat fluttered against his palm, too fast and too weak. "You've got to fight." This calf represented more than just the offspring of a valuable cow. Duchess had been the cornerstone of Tom's plan to rebuild his herd with superior bloodlines. Her previous calves had commanded top prices in Denver, and this birth was supposed to mark the beginning of Pine Ridge Ranch's return to prosperity. Instead, it had become another reminder that the world didn't care about Tom McKenna's plans or his desperate need for something to go right. The financial pressures bearing down on Pine Ridge Ranch would have broken a lesser man months ago. The letter from banker Samuel Whitman sat folded in Tom's coat pocket, its contents as familiar as his own name. $3,200 due in full by January 15th. It was a sum that might as well have been $3 million for all the chance Tom had of raising it by the deadline. The drought of 1883 had killed half his herd. The early winter of 1884 had forced him to sell cattle at rock-bottom prices just to buy enough feed to keep the survivors alive. Now, with less than 3 weeks until the bank's deadline, Tom was looking at the very real possibility of losing everything he had spent 2 decades building. Jake Morrison appeared in the barn doorway, stomping snow from his boots. Tom's foreman was a man of 35 with the kind of quiet competence that made him invaluable in the day-to-day operations of the ranch. Behind him came the other hands. Bobby Chen, slight and quick, whose way with horses had overcome most of the prejudice he faced as one of the few Chinese men in the territory. Miguel Santos, whose knowledge of cattle was matched only by his loyalty to Tom. And old Pete Williams, who had been working cattle since before any of them were born. "How's she doing, boss?" Jake asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "Not good," Tom replied without looking up from the calf. "Too small, too weak, born in the wrong season to the wrong circumstances." Pete Williams, his white beard stained yellow from years of tobacco, shook his head sadly. "Seen plenty like this one over the years. Sometimes nature just ain't ready to be kind." Bobby Chen moved closer to examine the calf, his dark eyes taking in the animal's labored breathing and weak movements. "Could try bottle feeding," he suggested. "Seen it work before with premature foals." "With a horse, maybe," Miguel said, his accented English careful and precise. "But a calf this weak, in weather like this, would be a miracle." Tom looked up at his men, seeing his own doubts reflected in their faces. They were good men, all of them, who had stayed loyal even as Tom's financial situation became increasingly desperate. They deserved better than to watch their employer chase impossible dreams. "Want me to take care of it, boss?" Miguel asked gently, his meaning clear. Sometimes mercy came in forms that were hard to stomach, but it was still mercy. Tom considered the offer. It would be the reasonable thing to do, the practical choice that any experienced rancher would make. The calf was suffering, and prolonging that suffering served no one. But as he looked down at the small creature, struggling for each breath, something in him rebelled against the idea of giving up. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the desperate hope of a man who had lost too much already. Or maybe it was just the simple fact that he couldn't bear to be the agent of one more death, even if it would be a kindness. "Give it tonight," Tom said finally. "If it's still alive come morning, we'll figure out what to do then." Jake exchanged glances with the other men. They all knew their boss had been pushing himself too hard lately, working from dawn to well past dusk, driving himself with the kind of relentless energy that came from desperation rather than hope. "Boss, you need your rest," Jake said carefully. "We can take turns watching it." "No," Tom said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "I'll stay with it." The men left reluctantly, their boots echoing on the wooden floor as they made their way back to the bunkhouse through the storm. Tom settled onto a pile of hay bales beside the calf, wrapping his heavy coat more tightly around his shoulders. The barn was warmer than the outside air, but still cold enough to see his breath. He had brought a thermos of coffee and enough lamp oil to last the night. The storm outside intensified as the hours passed, the wind driving snow against the barn walls with increasing fury. Tom dozed fitfully, jerking awake every time the calf's breathing changed or the wind found a new gap in the wooden siding to whistle through. Around midnight, he fed more wood into the small stove that provided what little heat the barn offered. The calf was weaker now, its breathing more labored. Tom had seen enough dying animals to recognize the signs. The small creature was losing its fight against cold and prematurity. By morning, it would likely be over, and with it, Tom's last realistic hope of avoiding financial ruin. It was then that he heard the knocking. At first, Tom thought it might be the wind, or perhaps one of the horses shifting restlessly in their stalls. But as he listened more carefully, straining to hear above the storm, he realized someone was at the barn door. The knocking came again, more insistent this time, the sound of human fists against heavy wood. Tom stood slowly, his joints stiff from sitting in the cold for hours. Who would be out in weather like this? His ranch hands were all asleep in the bunkhouse, and no traveler in his right mind would be on the roads during a blizzard that had already dropped more than a foot of snow. He made his way to the barn door and pulled it open, immediately regretting the action as the wind drove snow into his face with stinging force. At first, he saw nothing but the swirling white of the storm. Then, like something conjured from the darkness itself, a figure materialized from the blizzard. It was a woman, though it took Tom a moment to be certain through the driving snow. She stood in the doorway, her dark coat inadequate for the weather, her hair whipped by the wind into a tangle of wet strands. Snow clung to her clothes and her eyelashes, and she was shivering so violently that Tom could see it even through the storm. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I need shelter." Tom stared at her for a moment, too surprised to respond immediately. In the 3 years since he had withdrawn from most social contact, unexpected visitors had become rare. His first instinct was wariness, the caution of a man who had learned that complications usually came in human form. But as he looked at the woman standing in his doorway, clearly on the verge of collapse from cold and exhaustion, his basic humanity overrode his caution. No one deserved to be left outside in weather like this, regardless of who they were or why they had come to his door in the middle of a blizzard. "Get inside," Tom said, stepping back to allow her entry. "You'll freeze to death out there." The woman stumbled into the barn, nearly falling as the sudden warmth hit her cold-shocked system. Tom reached out instinctively to steady her, his hands gripping her arms, and was surprised by how solid she felt despite her obvious exhaustion. This was not a delicate woman, but someone accustomed to physical work. As she moved into the lamplight, Tom got his first clear look at her. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with dark brown hair that hung in damp strands around her face and brown eyes that held an unusual combination of desperation and determination. Her clothes, though soaked and travel-stained, were well-made and practical. This was clearly a respectable woman who had somehow found herself in desperate circumstances. "Thank you," she said, her voice still shaky from cold but stronger now that she was out of the wind. "I didn't know where else to go." "What in God's name are you doing out in this weather?" Tom asked, closing the barn door firmly against the storm. "Where did you come from?" The woman looked around the barn, taking in the warm glow of the lamp, the neat rows of stalls, and the small stove that provided blessed heat. Her gaze lingered on the newborn calf lying in its bed of straw, and Tom noticed something change in her expression. The desperation was still there, but it was joined by something else, something that looked almost like professional interest. "I walked from town," she said, still looking at the calf. "Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house put me out, said there wasn't room for my sort." Tom felt a familiar anger rise in his chest. Emma Henderson was a narrow-minded woman who had appointed herself the moral guardian of Pine Ridge, judging others while contributing nothing useful to the community herself. The idea of her turning someone out into a blizzard was exactly the kind of petty cruelty he had come to expect from so-called decent people. Your sort? Tom asked, his voice sharp with anger at the implication. The woman's cheeks colored with shame, and she looked down at herself as if seeing her appearance through critical eyes. She was, Tom realized, a large woman, not just tall, though she was certainly that at nearly 6 feet, but full-figured in a way that the narrow-minded people of Pine Ridge would find objectionable. In a society that prized delicate femininity above almost all other qualities in women, she would be seen as ungainly, unfeminine, undesirable. I know what I look like, she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of such judgments. Mrs. Henderson made it quite clear that decent boarding houses don't have room for women like me. Tom's anger intensified, but he kept his voice level. He had little patience for people who judged others based on appearance rather than character. His own Margaret had been small and delicate, but some of the strongest and most capable people he had known came in packages that society deemed inadequate. Miss Henderson is a fool, Tom said bluntly. What's your name? Grace Sullivan, the woman replied, looking up at him with surprise. Clearly, she was not accustomed to people defending her against such treatment. Well, Miss Sullivan, you're welcome to wait out the storm here. It's not much warmer than outside, but at least you're out of the wind. Grace Sullivan nodded gratefully, but her attention had already returned to the calf. She moved closer to where the animal lay, her movements careful and deliberate. Tom watched as she knelt beside the newborn, her hands hovering over its small body as if she were afraid to touch without permission. How long has it been like this? She asked, and Tom noticed that her voice had taken on a different quality. Gone was the desperate woman pleading for shelter. This was someone asking a professional question. Born about 4 hours ago, Tom replied, moving to stand behind her. Mother died in the birthing. Calf's been going downhill ever since. Grace Sullivan's hands moved with surprising confidence as she began to gently examine the calf. She checked its breathing by placing her ear close to its nostrils, felt along its ribs with practiced fingers, and lifted its head to look into its clouded eyes. Her touch was gentle but sure, and Tom found himself watching with growing interest. Premature, Grace said, more to herself than to him. Maybe a week early. Cold-stressed, dehydrated, low blood sugar. She paused, her hands continuing to move over the calf's body with the systematic thoroughness of someone who knew exactly what to look for. But not hopeless, not yet. Tom felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in months. Hope was a dangerous emotion for a man in his situation, but he couldn't quite suppress the sudden flutter of possibility that Grace Sullivan's confident assessment had awakened. You know about animals? He asked, trying to keep the eagerness out of his voice. Grace looked up at him, and for the first time since she had stumbled into his barn, she smiled. It was a tentative smile, as if she wasn't quite sure she had permission to feel confident about anything, but it transformed her face completely. Where before Tom had seen only a desperate woman seeking shelter, now he saw intelligence, competence, and something that might have been hope. My father was a veterinarian in Nebraska, she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke about something she clearly knew well. Dr. Patrick Sullivan. He taught me everything he could about animal medicine. Said I had a natural gift for it. Tom's mind raced as he processed this information. A woman with actual veterinary training was almost unheard of in the territory. Most of the so-called animal doctors were little better than horse traders with a bag of patent medicines. If Grace Olives truly possessed the skills her father had taught her, she might be able to save the calf that represented his last hope for financial survival. What happened to your father's practice? Tom asked. Grace's face clouded over, the brief confidence dimming. Father died of pneumonia 2 years ago. The practice went to his brother, my uncle. Uncle William didn't see much use for a woman who, she gestured vaguely at her figure, who looked like me. Said no one would trust a female veterinarian, especially not one of my size. He kept the practice and the farm, told me to find a husband or find a different way to make my living. Tom felt his anger return, this time directed at a man he had never met. The idea of someone throwing away genuine skill because of prejudice was exactly the kind of waste that infuriated him. So you came west? I tried to find work in towns along the way, Grace said, her attention returning to the calf. But Uncle William was right about one thing. People don't want to trust their animals to a woman, and they especially don't want to trust them to a woman who doesn't look like their idea of what a woman should be. Can you save it? Tom asked, bringing the conversation back to the immediate crisis. Grace Sullivan looked down at the calf again, her practiced hands continuing their examination. When she looked up at Tom, her brown eyes held a mixture of professional assessment and personal determination. Maybe, she said finally, it's going to need intensive care for the next few days. Feeding every 2 hours around the clock, constant warmth, and someone who won't give up on it when things look darkest. What do you need? Tom asked without hesitation. Grace seemed surprised by his immediate acceptance of her offer. Warm milk, clean cloths, honey if you have it, and somewhere to stay close by. This little one can't be left alone for more than an hour or two if we want it to survive. There's a room attached to the tack room, Tom said, pointing toward the far end of the barn. It's small, but there's a bed and a stove. You're welcome to use it for as long as you need. Grace Sullivan stared at him for a long moment, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Just like that? You don't know anything about me beyond what I've told you. Tom looked down at the dying calf, then back at the woman who might be able to save it. In the lamplight, with her wet hair pushed back from her face and her brown eyes bright with professional interest, she looked capable and determined. More importantly, she looked like someone who understood what it meant to fight for something that others had given up on. I know you're out in a blizzard because someone judged you unfairly, Tom said. I know you've got skills that might save this calf. And I know you're willing to work through the night for an animal you've never seen before, owned by a man you just met. That tells me more about your character than a letter of recommendation ever could. For a moment, Grace Sullivan just stared at him, and Tom saw tears gather in her eyes. He realized that simple human decency and respect for her abilities were apparently things she had grown unused to experiencing. Thank you, she said softly. I won't let you down. I believe you, Tom said, and was surprised to find that he meant it completely. As Grace Sullivan began to work, Tom found himself watching her with growing amazement. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this many times before, her large hands surprisingly gentle as she manipulated the calf's limbs and checked its vital signs. She asked Tom to help her move the animal closer to the stove, then began the process of warming it slowly and carefully. The most dangerous thing right now is the cold, Grace explained as she worked, her voice taking on the teaching tone of someone passing on important knowledge. Premature animals can't regulate their body temperature properly. We need to warm this little one gradually, or we could send it into shock. Tom found himself hanging on her every word, not just because the calf's survival might depend on following her instructions, but because it had been years since he had heard someone speak with such confidence and expertise about something he cared about. Grace Sullivan might be a woman society had rejected, but she clearly knew more about animal medicine than anyone else in 3 counties. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Grace sent Tom to the house for supplies, and he found himself hurrying through the storm with an energy he hadn't felt in months. When he returned with milk, clean rags, and honey, Grace had already fashioned a makeshift incubator around the calf using hay bales and blankets positioned to capture and hold the heat from the stove. We'll start with small amounts, Grace said as she warmed milk to exactly the right temperature. Too much too fast will overwhelm its digestive system. Too little and it won't have the energy to fight. Tom watched as she dipped a clean cloth in the warm milk and held it to the calf's mouth. At first there was no response. Then slowly the animal's tongue began to move. It was a small sign, but Grace smiled as if she had witnessed a miracle. There we go, she murmured to the calf. That's it, little one. Small sips. As the night progressed, Tom found himself drawn into Grace's quiet confidence. She worked steadily, checking the calf's temperature by touch, adjusting its position to ensure proper breathing, and offering encouragement, the soft voice of someone who genuinely cared about the outcome. Every 2 hours, she repeated the feeding process, and each time the calf seemed a little stronger. You're good at this, Tom said during one of these feeding sessions. Better than good. You're remarkable. Grace looked up at him, a flush of pleasure coloring her cheeks. Father always said I had the touch. Animals seem to trust me. Maybe because I understand what it's like to be seen as different. Different isn't the same as wrong, Tom said quietly. No, Grace agreed, looking down at the calf, which was now taking milk more eagerly from the cloth. But it took me a long time to learn that. As dawn began to break outside the barn, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, the calf made a sound that neither Tom nor Grace had heard during the long night. It was a weak bleat, barely audible, but it was the first sound the animal had made since its birth. Listen to that, Grace said, her face lighting up with joy. It's calling for its mother. Is that good? Whoop asked. It's wonderful, Grace replied. It means its survival instincts are kicking in. This little one isn't ready to give up. Whoop looked down at the calf, which was now holding its head up and looking around with clearer eyes, and felt something he hadn't experienced since Margaret and Sarah's death. Pure, uncomplicated hope. Not the desperate kind that came from having no other options, but the genuine article that grew from witnessing something remarkable happen against impossible odds. What do we do now? He asked. Now we keep doing what we're doing, Grace said, gently stroking the calf's head. It's not out of danger yet, but it's fighting. As long as it keeps fighting, we keep fighting with it. As Grace Sullivan settled into the routine of caring for the calf, Tom found himself watching her with something approaching wonder. In the space of one night, this woman who had appeared out of a blizzard like an answer to a prayer had not only saved an animal he had given up for dead, but had reminded him what it felt like to be part of something larger than his own troubles. For the first time in 3 years, Pine Ridge Ranch didn't feel like a place where everything Tom touched turned to dust. It felt like a place where miracles might be possible, where second chances weren't just desperate fantasies, and where the right person arriving at the right moment could change everything. As the sun climbed higher, painting the snow-covered landscape in brilliant white, Tom McKenna allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the worst of his troubles were behind him. He had no way of knowing that the real challenges were just beginning, or that saving the calf would turn out to be the easy part of what lay ahead. But for now, in the warm lamplight of the barn, with Grace Sullivan humming softly to a calf that was growing stronger by the hour, Tom felt something he had almost forgotten how to feel. He felt alive. 3 days passed like pages turning in a book Tom had never thought he'd be reading again. The rhythm of life at Pine Ridge Ranch had shifted completely, reorganized around the small miracle taking place in the barn. Grace Sullivan had settled into the tack room as if she had always belonged there, her presence bringing a quiet efficiency and purposefulness that Tom hadn't realized he'd been missing for the past 3 years. The calf, which Grace had named Hope during one of their midnight feeding sessions, grew stronger with each passing day. What had started as desperate measures to keep a dying animal alive had evolved into a routine of care that filled the barn with genuine purpose. Hope now stood on increasingly steady legs, bleating for her breakfast with growing vigor and confidence. Her dark eyes bright and alert where they had once been clouded with the dullness of approaching death. Tom found himself inventing reasons to visit the barn throughout the day, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. Sometimes he brought coffee for Grace, who worked tirelessly without complaint despite the demanding schedule of feeding Hope every 2 hours around the clock. Sometimes he carried reports about ranch business that could easily have waited until evening discussions. Most often, he simply came to watch Grace work, fascinated by her gentle competence and the way she spoke to all the animals as if they were old friends sharing important secrets. The transformation in both Grace and the barn was remarkable to witness. Where once Tom had seen only another burden added to his already overwhelming load of responsibilities, he now saw something that felt almost like hope itself taking physical form. Grace moved through the barn with quiet authority, checking on not just Hope, but all the animals, treating minor ailments with herbs and techniques that impressed even Pete Williams, who had been working with cattle longer than anyone else in the territory and wasn't easily amazed by new methods. Her knowledge seemed to extend far beyond what Tom had initially expected. She had reorganized the feed storage to prevent moisture problems, suggested improvements to ventilation that had already reduced respiratory issues among the horses, and demonstrated techniques for calming nervous animals that worked better than anything the ranch hands had tried before. It was becoming clear that Grace Sullivan wasn't just someone who happened to know something about animal care. She was a genuinely skilled professional who had been forced into hiding her abilities by a world that couldn't see past her appearance to recognize her value. "You're spoiling her," Grace said one morning as Tom arrived with a fresh pot of coffee and warm biscuits from the kitchen. Hope had just finished her feeding and lay contentedly in the straw, her belly round with milk, her breathing steady and strong, her entire demeanor speaking of an animal that was thriving under careful attention. "Which one of you am I spoiling?" Tom asked with a smile that felt foreign on his face after 3 years of grimness, but was becoming more natural with each passing day. The easy banter that had developed between them felt comfortable in a way that surprised him. Grace laughed, a sound that seemed to make the entire barn brighter and warmer despite the winter cold that pressed against the walls. The laugh transformed her face completely, revealing the woman she might have been if the world had treated her with more kindness and less judgment. "Both of us, probably, but I'm not complaining. I can't remember the last time someone brought me coffee just because they thought I might enjoy it, rather than because they wanted something from me." Tom settled onto a hay bale beside where Grace sat brushing Hope's increasingly sleek coat. The morning light streaming through the barn windows caught the auburn highlights in Grace's dark hair, and Tom noticed that 3 days of regular meals and restful sleep had brought healthy color back to her cheeks. She was, he realized with surprise, quite lovely in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with the inner light that showed when someone was doing work they loved and felt genuinely valued for their contributions. The routine they had established felt natural and comfortable, as if they had been working together for months rather than just a few days. Tom would arrive each morning to find Grace already up and checking on Hope, her hair braided back practically, and her sleeves rolled up for work. They would discuss the calf's progress over coffee. Then Tom would update Grace on ranch business while she tended to other animals that needed attention. Jake and the other hands had quickly learned to bring sick or injured animals to Grace, rather than attempting to treat them themselves, and her success rate was remarkable enough to convince even the most skeptical of them that her knowledge was genuine. "Tell me about your father's practice," Tom said, settling more comfortably on the hay bale and genuinely curious about the man who had trained such a skilled veterinarian. "What was it like learning from him? It must have been unusual for a girl to get that kind of training." Grace's face softened with memory, the way it always did when she spoke of her father. Her hands never stopped their gentle work on Hope's coat, but her expression grew distant with remembrance. Father was different from most men of his generation. He never saw any reason why a woman couldn't learn veterinary medicine if she had the aptitude and dedication for it. "Mother died when I was 8 years old, and after that I spent most of my time following him on his rounds instead of staying home with a governess like other girls my age were expected to do." She paused in her brushing, her large hands surprisingly gentle on Hope's flanks. The calf had grown noticeably stronger even in the past day, her movements more confident and her appetite increasingly robust. He used to say that animals didn't care if their doctor wore skirts or trousers, only whether they had healing hands and a kind heart. "I learned to assist with surgeries when I was 12 years old, could diagnose most common conditions by 14. Father said I had instincts he couldn't teach, that I could read animals the way some people read books, understanding what they needed even when they couldn't communicate it directly." Tom heard the pride in her voice, mixed with the deep sadness of loss that he recognized from his own experience with grief. The pain of losing someone who believed in you completely was something he understood too well. He sounds like a wise man and a good father. Not many men would have been willing to challenge convention that way. He was both wise and good, and he was preparing to make me a full partner in the practice when he died unexpectedly of pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. Had even started talking to people in town about accepting a female veterinarian, trying to change attitudes slowly and carefully so that the transition would be easier when the time came. Grace's voice grew bitter, the warmth fading from her expression as she continued. "Uncle William undid all of that work in a single day, told everyone that Father's ideas about women in medicine were just the foolish notions of a sick man who wasn't thinking clearly during his final illness. Your uncle was a fool and a waste of good air," Tom said with conviction that surprised him with its intensity. The anger he felt on Grace's behalf was unexpected in its strength. Any man who would waste talent like yours doesn't deserve to call himself a businessman, let alone someone carrying on the work of a healer. Before Grace could respond to Tom's unexpectedly fierce defense of her abilities, Jake Morrison appeared in the barn doorway, stomping snow from his boots with the deliberate movements of a man who had something important to communicate. Tom's foreman looked uncomfortable, the way he always did when he had news that might not be welcome but couldn't be avoided or delayed. "Morning, Miss Grace," Jake said, tipping his hat respectfully. Over the past 3 days, all of Tom's ranch hands had developed a genuine fondness for Grace, impressed not only by her obvious skill with animals, but by her tireless dedication to Hope's care and her willingness to help with any sick or injured animal that needed attention. "Morning, Jake," Grace replied warmly, setting down her brush to give the foreman her full attention. Her ability to make people feel heard and valued was another quality that Tom had noticed and appreciated. "How's that gelding's hoof looking today? Has the swelling gone down?" "Much better, thanks to that poultice you suggested. That mixture of herbs you put together worked better than anything Dr. Harrison ever prescribed for hoof problems. That's actually part of what I came to talk to the boss about." Jake shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly choosing his words carefully in the way of a man who knew he was about to deliver troubling news. Tom stood, sensing the gravity in Jake's manner and feeling the familiar tightness in his stomach that came whenever crisis threatened. After 3 years of one disaster following another, he had developed an instinct for recognizing when bad news was approaching. "What kind of news, Jake? From your expression, it's not good." "Got some word from town yesterday when Bobby went in for supplies. Dr. Harrison was by the general store, and he was talking to anyone who would listen about some kind of sickness that's broken out at the Bartlett Ranch, about 10 miles north of here. According to what Harrison told Whitmore, they've lost 6 head already, and more are showing symptoms every day." Tom felt his blood chill as if someone had opened the barn door to let in the winter wind. Disease could spread through a herd faster than wildfire across dry grass, jumping from ranch to ranch with devastating speed. The Bartlett Ranch was close enough that contamination was a very real possibility. And if sickness reached Pine Ridge Ranch, it could destroy what remained of his already depleted herd and eliminate any chance of meeting his financial obligations to the bank. The timing couldn't be worse, with his deadline less than 3 weeks away and Hope still requiring intensive care that kept Grace busy around the clock. "What kind of symptoms did Dr. Harrison describe?" Grace asked. Her professional interest immediately engaged in a way that made Tom grateful once again for her presence on the ranch. Having someone with genuine veterinary knowledge available during a potential crisis felt like a gift from Providence. Jake looked surprised that Grace had spoken up, then quickly remembered who he was talking to and that her opinion carried real weight around Pine Ridge Ranch now. The men had all learned to respect her expertise, even if they didn't fully understand how a woman had come to possess such knowledge. Dr. Harrison said the affected animals showed high fever, severe weakness, wouldn't eat or drink anything. Some kind of respiratory trouble too, from what Bill Bartlett described to him when he called for help. Grace and Tom exchanged glances loaded with mutual concern and understanding. Grace's expression had grown serious, her mind clearly working through the possibilities with the systematic approach of someone trained to diagnose based on symptoms and to consider all the potential causes before jumping to conclusions. "Could be several different things," Grace said thoughtfully, already shifting into the analytical mode Tom had learned to recognize and respect. "Without examining the affected animals myself, it's difficult to know for certain what we're dealing with. But if it's genuinely contagious and it's spreading as quickly as Dr. Harrison suggests, it's definitely something we need to take very seriously indeed." Tom felt the familiar weight of impending crisis settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat made of lead. Just when things had begun to look hopeful for the first time in years, another disaster loomed on the horizon, threatening to destroy everything he had worked to rebuild. The irony wasn't lost on him that Grace's arrival had brought the first real hope he'd experienced since Margaret and Sarah's death. And now that hope was threatened by circumstances completely beyond anyone's control. "There's more, boss," Jake continued reluctantly, the tone of his voice suggesting that the worst part of his news was yet to come. "Word around town is that Dr. Harrison is completely overwhelmed by the situation. He's got more sick animals than he can possibly handle across 3 different ranches now, And he's starting to talk about recommending that people start putting down affected cattle to prevent further spread of whatever this disease might be. That's premature and probably the wrong approach entirely, Grace said sharply, her professional instincts clearly offended by what she considered hasty and potentially harmful decision-making. You don't start killing animals until you know exactly what you're dealing with and have exhausted all other reasonable treatment options. Mass culling should be a last resort, not a first response. Tom looked at Grace, seeing the fire in her brown eyes that came when she encountered something that challenged her deeply held beliefs about proper animal care and responsible veterinary practice. An idea began forming in his mind, dangerous perhaps, but potentially the solution to multiple problems at once. Grace, Tom said slowly, his mind working through the implications of what he was about to suggest. If someone were to ask for your help with this outbreak, would you be willing to take a look at the affected animals and see if you could determine what's really causing the problem? Grace didn't hesitate for even a moment, her response immediate and definitive. Of course I would. Any veterinarian worth the title would want to help stop a disease outbreak that's threatening the livelihoods of honest ranchers. But Dr. Harrison would never accept assistance from a woman, especially not one without official credentials or recognition from the Territorial Medical Board. Dr. Harrison isn't the only one who gets to make decisions about animal care in this territory, Tom said with growing conviction. If ranchers are desperate enough, they might be willing to try unconventional solutions, especially if those solutions come from someone who has already proven her abilities. Jake looked back and forth between Tom and Grace, clearly trying to understand what was being proposed and whether his boss had lost his mind entirely. The idea of a woman taking on the role of a veterinarian was so far outside normal experience that it seemed almost impossible to process. Boss, you thinking about Miss Grace taking a look at those sick cattle? Because I've got to tell you, the men around here aren't exactly known for their progressive thinking about women in professional roles. I'm thinking about Miss Grace potentially saving a lot of animals and a lot of ranchers' livelihoods, Tom replied firmly, his conviction growing stronger as he spoke. And maybe proving to this territory that skill and knowledge matter more than convention and prejudice when people's lives are at stake. Grace stared at Tom, her expression cycling through surprise, hope, fear, and something that might have been gratitude for his faith in her abilities. Tom, if I were to attempt something like that and fail, it could make things worse for everyone involved. People would say that desperate ranchers trusted a woman when they should have listened to the real doctor with proper credentials. And if I succeeded, she paused, considering the implications carefully. If I succeeded, there are people who would never forgive the fact that a woman showed them up and proved them wrong. And if we do nothing, animals die unnecessarily, and good ranchers lose everything they've worked their entire lives to build, Tom countered. Sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks that look foolish to people who don't understand what's really at stake. Before anyone could respond to this exchange, the sound of approaching hooves interrupted their conversation. Tom looked toward the barn door as a rider appeared through the swirling snow, moving with the obvious urgency of someone carrying important and probably troubling news. It was Bobby Chen, returning from what should have been a routine trip to town for supplies. But his normally calm and composed demeanor was replaced by obvious agitation and concern. Bobby dismounted quickly, his slight frame moving with the quick efficiency that made him so valuable around the ranch, despite his small stature. Boss, we got serious problems, big ones that are getting worse by the hour. Tom felt his stomach drop as he prepared for whatever bad news Bobby was bringing. The day had started with such promise, and now it seemed like everything was falling apart again. What kind of problems, Bobby? How bad are we talking? That outbreak at the Bartlett place? It spread to at least 2 more ranches, maybe more by now. The Peterson spread lost 8 head overnight, and Old Man Crawford found 3 of his prize bulls dead this morning when he went out to check on the herd. Bobby paused, catching his breath from his hard ride through the increasingly heavy snow. Darn. Harrison's talking about recommending a quarantine of the whole northern section of the territory. Grace stood abruptly, her face pale with understanding of what Bobby was describing and its implications for everyone in the area. A quarantine would be devastating for everyone involved, not just the ranchers who have sick animals. If healthy ranchers can't move cattle to market, Even perfectly healthy animals become worthless until the quarantine is lifted, which could take months. Gets worse than that, Bobby continued, his usually cheerful expression grim with concern and something that looked like anger. There's a man from Denver in town, name of Ezra Blackwood, says he's a cattle buyer looking for investment opportunities in the territory, but he's asking a lot of very specific questions about which ranchers might be interested in selling their operations quick and cheap. Tom felt anger rise in his chest like heat from a forge, accompanied by a growing suspicion that what they were dealing with wasn't entirely natural. Blackwood was exactly the kind of vulture who circled during other people's disasters, looking for opportunities to profit from desperation and misfortune. The fact that he had appeared just as the disease outbreak began struck Tom as suspiciously convenient, far too convenient to be mere coincidence. "What kind of offers is this Blackwood making?" Tom asked, though he dreaded hearing the answer and suspected he already knew what kind of predatory behavior they were dealing with. "Half of fair market value and only for healthy stock that he can verify personally hasn't been exposed to whatever's making the other cattle sick. Says it's because of the financial risk involved in buying during an outbreak. But Pete Williams was in town when Blackwood was talking to the banker. Says it sounded like Blackwood already knew exactly which ranches were in serious financial trouble and how desperate their situations really were." The pieces clicked together in Tom's mind with sickening clarity, forming a picture that was far more sinister than a simple disease outbreak. Blackwood hadn't just appeared at a convenient time by pure accident. He had been planning this, waiting for the perfect opportunity to acquire valuable land and livestock at bargain prices. The disease outbreak provided him with exactly the crisis he needed to force desperate men into making desperate decisions that would benefit him enormously while destroying their lives. "We need to warn the other ranchers about what Blackwood is really doing," Tom said, his voice tight with controlled anger and growing determination to fight back against what was clearly a deliberate scheme. "Already did what I could," Bobby replied, shaking his head with frustration. "But most of them are too worried about their own herds to think clearly about business deals or long-term consequences. Fear makes men do stupid things, and Blackwood knows exactly how to take advantage of that fear to get what he wants." Grace had been listening to this exchange with growing concern, but now she stepped forward with the decisive manner Tom had come to recognize as her way of cutting through confusion to focus on what really mattered and what could actually be done about it. "I need to see those sick animals myself," she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. "Whatever's causing this outbreak, it's spreading too fast and too selectively to be entirely natural. Something about this whole situation doesn't feel right to me." Tom looked at Grace, seeing the determination in her eyes and recognizing it as the same quality that had saved Hope's life against impossible odds. If anyone could figure out what was really happening with this disease outbreak, it would be someone with her combination of professional skill, practical experience, and intuitive understanding of how things should work versus how they were actually working. "It could be dangerous," Tom warned, though he was already convinced that Grace was right to want to investigate personally. "If this disease is as contagious as it seems to be, you could be exposing yourself to serious risk by getting close to affected animals. And if I don't look, more animals die unnecessarily and more ranchers lose everything they've spent their lives building." Grace countered with steel in her voice that brooked no argument. "Besides, if this outbreak is as suspicious as it's beginning to seem, someone needs to investigate who isn't afraid to ask uncomfortable questions about who really benefits from all this destruction." Jake, who had been following this conversation with increasing amazement at the turn events had taken, finally spoke up. "Boss, you really think Miss Grace should get involved in something this big and potentially dangerous? I mean, no disrespect intended toward Miss Grace and her abilities, but the men in this territory aren't exactly known for their progressive thinking about women taking on professional roles. The men in this territory are about to lose everything they've worked for," Grace replied with a firmness that left no room for argument or discussion. "If that doesn't make them progressive in their thinking, at least it might make them practical about accepting help from anyone who can actually provide it." Tom made his decision with the same instinct that had told him to take Grace in during the blizzard 4 days ago. Sometimes the right choice looked like the riskiest one, but that didn't make it wrong. Sometimes doing the right thing required taking chances that other people would consider foolish. "We'll start with the Peterson Ranch," Tom said decisively, his mind already working through the logistics of what they needed to do. "Bill Peterson is a reasonable man who's known me for 20 years, and if his situation is as bad as Bobby says it is, he might be willing to try anything that offers even a remote hope of saving his herd. I'll need to examine the affected animals thoroughly and systematically," Grace said, already shifting into professional mode with the focused intensity Tom had learned to admire and depend upon. "And I'll need to talk extensively to the ranch hands who've been caring for the sick animals. Sometimes the people closest to a situation see details and patterns that others miss because they're looking at the big picture instead of the specific facts." As they prepared to leave Pine Ridge Ranch on what could be either a mission of mercy or a complete disaster that would destroy any chance Tom had of maintaining his reputation in the territory, Tom found himself studying Grace's face in the lamplight. The woman who had stumbled into his barn 4 nights ago as a desperate refugee from other people's prejudices and cruelty was now preparing to take on an entire territory's worth of problems. The transformation was remarkable, but it shouldn't have been surprising. Grace Sullivan had always possessed this strength and competence and determination. She had just been waiting for someone to give her the chance to use them and to believe in her abilities. The ride to the Peterson Ranch took nearly 3 hours through snow that continued to fall with relentless persistence, each flake adding to the growing drifts that made travel increasingly difficult. Tom and Grace traveled together, their horses picking their way carefully along trails that were rapidly becoming indistinguishable from the surrounding prairie. They spoke little during the journey, both lost in their own thoughts about what they might find when they arrived and what the consequences of their intervention might be for everyone involved. The Peterson Ranch sat in a valley sheltered by low hills, its buildings arranged around a central yard that should have been bustling with the normal activity of a working cattle operation. Instead, as they approached through the swirling snow, Tom could see immediately that something was seriously wrong. Ranch hands moved between the barns and corrals with the grim efficiency of people dealing with an ongoing crisis, and the usual sounds of healthy cattle were replaced by an ominous quiet that spoke of sickness and death. Bill Peterson met them at the main house, his weathered face showing the strain of a man watching his livelihood disappear before his eyes, despite everything he could do to prevent it. Peterson was a contemporary of Tom's, a solid rancher who had built his operation through decades of hard work and careful planning. The desperation in his eyes was painful to see, a reflection of Tom's own fears about what financial ruin looked like when it finally arrived at a man's door. "Tom McKenna," Peterson said, extending his hand in greeting, despite the circumstances. "Didn't expect to see you out in weather like this. Heard through the grapevine that you had some serious troubles of your own to deal with." "Nothing compared to yours, apparently," Tom replied, gripping Peterson's hand and feeling the calluses that spoke of a lifetime of honest work and dedication. "Bill, I'd like you to meet Grace Sullivan. She's got extensive experience with animal medicine, and she might be able to help figure out what's making your cattle sick." Peterson looked at Grace with obvious confusion and no small amount of skepticism. The idea of a woman veterinarian was so far outside his experience that he seemed to be having trouble processing the suggestion that she might be able to help where Dr. Harrison had apparently failed completely. "No offense intended, miss," Peterson said carefully, his tone suggesting he was trying to be polite while expressing serious doubts about the wisdom of this approach. "But Dr. Harrison has already been by twice to look at the affected animals, and he's about as good a veterinarian as we've got in this territory. If a trained professional can't figure out what's wrong, I'm not sure what anyone else could do to help the situation." "Dr. Harrison is a good man and a competent veterinarian," Grace replied diplomatically, her tone suggesting genuine respect for a colleague, while implying that other approaches might be worth trying. "But sometimes a fresh perspective can see things that familiarity might miss, and sometimes unconventional thinking can solve problems that conventional approaches can't handle." Peterson glanced at Tom, clearly seeking guidance about this unprecedented situation and whether he should trust his desperate circumstances to someone so far outside the normal expectations. Tom nodded encouragingly, and Peterson's desperation finally overrode his skepticism about accepting help from a woman. I suppose it couldn't hurt to have another set of eyes look at them, Peterson said reluctantly, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who had tried everything he could think of. Though I'll warn you, miss, it's not a pretty sight in there. Whatever's got into them, it's hitting hard and fast, and we're losing animals every few hours now. The barn that housed the sick cattle was a scene that would haunt Tom's dreams for years to come. More than a dozen animals lay in various stages of illness, their breathing labored and their eyes dull with fever and approaching death. The smell of sickness hung heavy in the air like a physical presence, and the usual energy of a healthy herd was replaced by an oppressive quiet broken only by occasional sounds of distress that spoke of genuine suffering and the approach of death. Grace moved among the animals with the careful attention of a true professional, examining each one methodically, while Peterson and his foreman provided detailed accounts of how the symptoms had developed and progressed. Tom watched her work, impressed not only by her calm competence in the face of what was clearly a serious crisis, but by the way she managed to maintain her professional demeanor while still showing genuine compassion for the suffering animals. After spending more than 2 hours examining every sick animal and questioning Peterson and his men about every detail of their care and feeding routines, Grace finally stepped outside the barn to speak privately with Tom. Her expression was grim, and Tom could see anger building in her eyes. "This isn't right," she said quietly, her professional composure barely containing obvious fury at what she had discovered. "What I'm seeing in there doesn't match any natural disease pattern I've ever encountered or read about in any veterinary text." "What exactly do you mean?" Tom asked, though he suspected he already knew what Grace was going to tell him and dreaded having his suspicions confirmed. "The distribution of affected animals, the rapid onset of symptoms, the specific combination of signs I'm observing, the fact that some animals are completely unaffected while others in the same pen are dying. It all points to deliberate poisoning rather than natural disease transmission." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation too serious to be made lightly. Tom felt anger building in his chest like a fire being fed with dry wood, but he forced himself to consider the implications carefully before responding. "Are you absolutely certain about that assessment?" "As certain as I can be without chemical analysis of tissue samples from the dead animals," Grace replied with professional conviction. "But Tom, if someone is deliberately causing these outbreaks to force ranchers into selling cheap to someone like Blackwood, we're looking at a conspiracy that could destroy every honest rancher in the territory." Tom stared at Grace, seeing the professional certainty in her eyes, and knowing that she wouldn't make such a serious accusation without solid evidence to support it. If she was right, then they weren't just fighting a disease outbreak. They were fighting something much more dangerous and much more personal, something that threatened the very foundation of honest ranching in the territory. "What do we do now?" Tom asked, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "Now we gather evidence," Grace replied with grim determination that reminded Tom of a soldier preparing for battle. "We examine animals at the other affected ranches and document everything we find. And then we figure out how to prove what's really happening before more good people lose everything they've worked for." As they prepared to continue their investigation, Tom realized that the stakes had grown far beyond saving Hope, or even saving Pine Ridge Ranch. They were now fighting for the survival of an entire way of life, and Grace Sullivan had become his partner in the most important battle either of them would ever fight. The next morning dawned clear and bitter cold, the kind of Wyoming winter day that could freeze a man's breath in his lungs and turn his thoughts as sharp as the wind that cut across the plains. Tom stood at his kitchen window, coffee steaming in his hands, watching Grace make her way across the yard toward the barn. Even from this distance, he could see the determination in her stride, the set of her shoulders that spoke of someone who had made peace with a difficult decision. They had spent the previous evening examining sick animals at 2 more ranches, and each investigation had only confirmed Grace's initial assessment. The pattern was too deliberate to be natural, too convenient for Ezra Blackwood's business interests to be coincidental. What they were dealing with wasn't a disease outbreak at all, but a carefully orchestrated campaign of destruction designed to force honest ranchers into selling their life's work for a fraction of its worth. The evidence was mounting, but proving it would require more than veterinary expertise. It would require courage, strategy, and the kind of community support that Tom wasn't certain they could generate. The people of this territory had spent generations trusting conventional authority figures. Convincing them to listen to a woman veterinarian making accusations against a wealthy businessman from Denver would be the challenge of a lifetime. Tom finished his coffee and pulled on his coat, preparing to join Grace in the barn where Hope waited for her morning feeding. The calf had become more than just a symbol of their partnership. She had become proof that impossible things could happen when the right people came together at the right time. If they could save a dying calf against all odds, perhaps they could save an entire community against even longer odds. As Tom crossed the yard, he saw Jake Morrison riding hard toward the ranch house, his horse breathing steam in the cold air and his expression grim with urgent news. Tom's stomach tightened with familiar dread. After 3 days of mounting crisis, he had learned to expect each new piece of information to be worse than the last. "Boss," Jake called out as he dismounted, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "We got a problem. Big one." "What now?" Tom asked, bracing himself for whatever disaster Jake was bringing. "Mr. Harrison's called a meeting for tomorrow night at the community hall in town. Says he's recommending immediate quarantine of all ranches in the affected area, and he wants the territorial marshal to enforce it. No cattle movement, no contact between ranches, no selling or buying until further notice." Tom felt his blood chill with understanding of what this meant. A quarantine would trap every rancher in the territory, making them completely vulnerable to Blackwood's manipulation. With no legal way to move cattle to market, even healthy herds would become worthless overnight, and desperate men would have no choice but to accept whatever offers Blackwood chose to make. "There's more," Jake continued. "Blackwood's been busy since yesterday. He's already made offers to 3 more ranchers, and word is he's got backing from some kind of investment group in Denver. Money enough to buy up half the territory if he can get the prices low enough." Before Tom could respond, Grace emerged from the barn, having overheard the conversation. Her face was pale with anger, but her voice was steady with professional determination. "We can't let that quarantine happen," she said firmly. "It's exactly what Blackwood needs to complete his scheme. Trapped ranchers with worthless cattle will have to sell at whatever price he offers, and he'll end up owning thousands of acres of prime grazing land for pennies on the dollar." Tom looked at Grace, seeing the fire in her eyes that had become familiar over the past week. She had transformed from a desperate woman seeking shelter into a fierce advocate for justice, and her passion was infectious in a way that made him believe impossible things might be possible. "What do you propose we do about it?" Tom asked. "We can't just walk into that meeting and accuse Dr. Harrison of being part of a conspiracy. He's respected in this community, and he gestured between himself and Grace. "We're a financially desperate widower and a woman with no official credentials making wild accusations." "Then we don't make accusations," Grace said with the kind of quiet intensity that meant she was thinking through a complex problem. "We present evidence. We ask questions. We make people think instead of just telling them what to think." Jake looked back and forth between them, clearly struggling to understand how they intended to challenge the combined authority of Dr. Harrison and a wealthy businessman from Denver. "Boss, with respect, I'm not sure people are ready to listen to alternative viewpoints, especially not from Miss Grace. No offense intended, miss, but this territory isn't exactly progressive in its thinking about women in professional roles." "Then maybe it's time for this territory to become more progressive," Grace replied with steel in her voice. "Because the alternative is watching good people lose everything they've worked for while rich men from back east get richer." Over the next 24 hours, Tom and Grace worked with desperate intensity to prepare for what might be their only chance to expose Blackwood's scheme. Grace documented every detail of her examinations, noting the specific symptoms that pointed to poisoning rather than natural disease. Tom gathered financial information about the affected ranches, documenting the pattern of Blackwood's offers and their relationship to each rancher's debt situation. Most importantly, they quietly visited every rancher they could reach, not to make accusations, but to ask questions and plant seeds of doubt about the convenient timing of both the outbreak and Blackwood's arrival. They were careful not to mention Grace's theory about deliberate poisoning, instead focusing on encouraging people to think critically about who benefited from the crisis and whether the proposed solutions actually served the ranchers' interests. The community hall was packed on the evening of the meeting. Tom had never seen so many ranchers in one place, their faces lined with worry and their voices low with the kind of conversation that comes when men are facing the loss of everything they value. Dr. Harrison sat at the front of the room beside Ezra Blackwood, whose expensive suit and confident demeanor marked him as clearly different from every other man present. Blackwood was exactly what Tom had expected, smooth, well-dressed, and radiating the kind of casual authority that came from never having to doubt where his next meal was coming from. His smile was pleasant and his manner friendly, but there was something predatory in his eyes when he looked out over the assembled ranchers, like a hawk surveying a field full of mice. "Gentlemen," Dr. Harrison began, standing to address the crowd, "thank you all for coming out on such a difficult evening. As you know, we're facing the most serious livestock emergency this territory has seen in decades. The disease that has struck our community is spreading faster than we can contain it, and I'm afraid we have no choice but to take drastic measures to prevent complete devastation of our cattle industry." Murmurs of concern rippled through the crowd. Tom glanced around the room, seeing fear and desperation on every face. These were good men who had built their lives around honest work, and the prospect of losing everything they had worked for was written clearly in their expressions. "I've consulted with veterinary authorities in Denver and Cheyenne," Harrison continued, "and the unanimous recommendation is immediate quarantine of all affected ranches. No movement of cattle, no contact between operations, and no sales until we can determine the exact nature of this disease and how to combat it effectively." "How long would such a quarantine last?" called out Bill Peterson, his voice tight with worry. "That's difficult to say," Harrison replied. "It could be weeks, or it could be months. It all depends on how long it takes to identify the causative agent and develop effective treatments." Tom saw the effect of these words on the assembled ranchers. Weeks or months without income would bankrupt most of them, especially those already struggling with debt. Blackwood's presence at the front of the room suddenly made perfect sense to everyone present. "Now, I know this is a frightening prospect," Dr. Harrison continued, "but fortunately Mr. Blackwood here has generously offered to help our community through this crisis. He's prepared to purchase healthy cattle at fair prices, allowing ranchers to maintain some income while we work to resolve this situation." Blackwood stood, his smile warm and his manner sympathetic. "Gentlemen, I understand the difficult position you're all facing. No one should have to choose between financial ruin and the health of their animals. That's why I'm prepared to offer immediate cash payments for any healthy cattle you are willing to sell. It's not charity, it's business. I believe in the long-term potential of this territory, and I'm willing to take risks that others might not be comfortable with." Tom felt his anger building as he listened to Blackwood's smooth presentation. The man was positioning himself as a savior while actually orchestrating the crisis he claimed to be solving. It was masterfully done, and Tom could see that many of the ranchers were already beginning to view Blackwood as their salvation rather than their destruction. "What kind of prices are you offering?" asked Miguel Santos from the back of the room. "Fair market value adjusted for current circumstances," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Obviously, the quarantine situation creates some risk factors that have to be accounted for, but I'm prepared to offer 60% of standard market prices for healthy cattle that can be verified as disease-free." 60%. Tom felt sick as he realized how perfectly Blackwood had calculated his offer. It was low enough to represent enormous profit potential for him, but high enough that desperate ranchers would see it as better than losing everything. And once the quarantine was in place, it would be the only offer available. This was the moment. If Tom and Grace were going to act, it had to be now, before the ranchers committed to a course of action that would destroy them all. Tom stood slowly, feeling every eye in the room turned toward him. "I have some questions about this quarantine," Tom said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. Dr. Harrison looked surprised and not entirely pleased by the interruption. "Of course, Tom. What would you like to know?" "I'm wondering about the pattern of this disease outbreak," Tom said carefully. "It seems to have struck very specifically, affecting some ranches completely while leaving others untouched, even when they're adjacent to affected properties. That's unusual for a contagious disease, isn't it?" Harrison frowned, clearly not expecting this line of questioning. Disease patterns can be unpredictable, Tom. Wind patterns, water sources, animal movement. There are many factors that can influence how an outbreak spreads. I'm sure that's true, Tom replied, but I'm also curious about the timing. Mr. Blackwood, when exactly did you first learn about this outbreak? Blackwood's smile never wavered, but something flickered in his eyes that suggested Tom's question had hit closer to home than he would have liked. I received word about investment opportunities in this area approximately 2 weeks ago. I came to investigate the situation as soon as my schedule permitted. 2 weeks ago, Tom repeated. That would be before the first animal showed symptoms at the Bartlett Ranch. Interesting timing for learning about investment opportunities related to a crisis that hadn't happened yet. Murmurs began rippling through the crowd as people started to process the implications of what Tom was suggesting. Blackwood's expression remained pleasant, but his posture had stiffened slightly. I think there may be some confusion about the timeline, Blackwood said smoothly. The investment opportunities I was informed about had to do with the general economic pressures facing ranchers throughout the territory, not any specific disease outbreak. Tom nodded as if accepting this explanation, but continued pressing. Of course. And I'm sure it's just coincidence that you happened to arrive just as ranchers began facing exactly the kind of crisis that would make them desperate to sell quickly and cheaply. Before Blackwood could respond, Grace stood up from her seat near the back of the room. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every head turned toward her, and Tom could hear the sharp intake of breath that came from an entire room of men suddenly confronted with a woman claiming a voice in their proceedings. If I may, Grace said, her voice calm but carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hall, I've had the opportunity to examine some of the affected animals, and I've observed some things that might be relevant to this discussion. Dr. Harrison's face flushed red with indignation. Miss, I appreciate your concern, but veterinary diagnosis requires professional training and experience that I happen to possess, Grace interrupted smoothly. My father was Dr. Patrick Sullivan of Nebraska. I was trained by him from childhood and worked as his partner for several years before his death. The name meant nothing to most of the men present, but Tom saw recognition flicker across Dr. Harrison's face. Patrick Sullivan had apparently been known in veterinary circles, and his reputation carried enough weight to give Harrison pause. Even if that's true, Harrison said carefully, what you're suggesting is highly irregular. Veterinary diagnosis is serious business that requires systematic observation and logical analysis, Grace finished, which is exactly what I've been doing. And what I've observed doesn't match any natural disease pattern I've ever encountered. The hall erupted in surprised murmurs. Grace had their attention now, and Tom could see that some of the ranchers were beginning to look intrigued rather than skeptical. What exactly are you suggesting? Called out Pete Williams from the middle of the room. Grace took a deep breath, and Tom knew she was about to stake everything on a single moment of truth-telling. I'm suggesting that what we're dealing with isn't a disease at all. The symptoms I've observed, the pattern of affected animals, the rapid onset and selective nature of the illness, all point to deliberate poisoning rather than natural disease transmission. The hall exploded into chaos. Men jumped to their feet, shouting questions and accusations. Some directed their anger at Grace for making such a serious charge, others at Blackwood for being present during such accusations, and still others at Dr. Harrison for not considering such possibilities. Through it all, Blackwood remained seated and calm, his expression concerned but not panicked. He was either completely innocent or a very good actor. Tom studied the man's face, looking for signs of guilt or fear, but found only the controlled composure of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. Gentlemen, please, Dr. Harrison called out, trying to restore order. These are serious accusations being made without any concrete evidence. Miss Sullivan may be well-meaning, but I have evidence, Grace said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. The hall quieted as everyone strained to hear what she would say next. I have documentation of every examination I've conducted, notes on specific symptoms and their progression, and detailed observations about which animals were affected and which were not. Everything I've seen points to a systematic contamination rather than a naturally occurring disease. Even if that were true, Blackwood said, speaking for the first time since Grace's accusations began, It doesn't change the fact that these ranchers need immediate help. Whether the cause is disease or deliberate sabotage, people are losing their livelihoods and need options for protecting what they've built. It was a masterful response, Tom had to admit. Blackwood was acknowledging the possibility of sabotage while positioning himself as the solution regardless of the cause. He was either completely innocent or brilliant at damage control. "You're right that people need help," Grace replied, "but they need the right kind of help. A quarantine designed to combat a contagious disease won't do anything to stop deliberate poisoning. In fact, it would make the situation worse by trapping ranchers and making them more vulnerable to whoever is behind this." "And what would you propose instead?" Dr. Harrison asked, his tone suggesting he considered the question rhetorical. "Investigation," Grace said immediately. "Real investigation by people who know what to look for and aren't afraid to ask uncomfortable questions. Examination of feed sources, water supplies, and anyone who's had access to the affected ranches. Chemical analysis of tissue samples from dead animals to determine exactly what killed them." Tom saw several ranchers nodding thoughtfully at Grace's suggestions. Her proposals made logical sense, and her professional demeanor was beginning to win over men who had initially been skeptical about listening to a woman's opinions on veterinary matters. "Such investigations take time," Blackwood pointed out. "Time that these ranchers don't have if they're facing immediate financial obligations. My offer provides immediate relief while longer-term solutions are being developed." "Your offer provides immediate profit for you while permanently destroying the ranchers you claim to be helping," Tom said, standing again to support Grace's position. 60% of market value might seem generous now, but it's a fraction of what healthy cattle will be worth once this crisis is resolved." "If it's resolved," Blackwood corrected. "You're asking these men to gamble their families' futures on the possibility that you and this woman can solve a problem that trained professionals haven't been able to handle." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Tom realized that this was the crucial moment, the point where the community would either trust them enough to take an enormous risk or choose the safety of Blackwood's guaranteed offer. "You're right," Tom said quietly. "We are asking for trust, but we're asking you to trust people who live here, who are part of this community, whose own futures depend on getting this right. Mr. Blackwood's future doesn't depend on what happens to Pine Ridge or any other ranch in this territory. His future depends on buying as much land as possible for as little money as possible." Before Blackwood could respond, old Pete Williams stood up from his seat near the front of the room. Pete was the most respected rancher in the territory, a man whose opinion carried weight with everyone present. "I want to hear more of what Miss Sullivan has to say," Pete announced. "I've been raising cattle for 40 years, and something about this whole situation has felt wrong from the beginning. If she's got evidence that points to deliberate sabotage, I think we owe it to ourselves to listen." Other voices began joining in support of Pete's position. Not everyone was convinced, but enough people were willing to listen that Grace had a real opportunity to present her case. "Thank you," Grace said, moving toward the front of the room despite the obvious discomfort this caused some of the more conservative men present. "I'd like to show you exactly what I've observed and let you draw your own conclusions." For the next hour, Grace presented her findings with the systematic thoroughness of a trained professional. She described specific symptoms, documented the pattern of affected animals, and explained why the progression of illness didn't match any known disease profile. Her knowledge was comprehensive, her reasoning logical, and her presentation compelling enough to sway even some of the men who had initially been skeptical about listening to a woman discuss veterinary matters. By the time she finished, the mood in the hall had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a meeting to approve Dr. Harrison's quarantine recommendation had become a debate about whether the community was facing a natural disaster or a deliberate attack on their way of life. "Even if Miss Sullivan is correct about deliberate sabotage," Dr. Harrison said during a brief lull in the discussion, "we still need to take immediate action to protect healthy animals. The quarantine remains the most prudent course of action until we know more." "The quarantine is exactly what the saboteur wants," Grace replied firmly. "It traps everyone in place, prevents normal business operations, and makes ranchers desperate enough to accept unreasonably low offers for their cattle. If someone is deliberately trying to destroy the ranching community in this territory, a quarantine would be the perfect tool to complete that destruction." Tom watched the faces around the room, seeing the growing realization that Grace's logic made disturbing sense. A quarantine designed to combat disease would indeed be the perfect cover for completing a scheme based on economic manipulation. "So what do you propose we do instead?" called out Bill Peterson. "We investigate," Grace said. "We test water sources and feed supplies at all affected ranches. We analyze tissue samples from dead animals to determine the exact cause of death. We look at who has had access to these ranches and who benefits from their failure. And we do all of this quickly, before more animals die and more ranchers are forced into desperate situations." "And in the meantime," Peterson pressed, "what do we do about immediate financial pressures? Some of us can't wait weeks or months for investigations to be completed." This was the crucial question, and Tom knew their answer would determine whether the community united behind their approach or fractured into those who trusted Blackwood's offer and those who wanted to fight. "We support each other," Tom said, standing to address the room. "We pool resources, share feed and pasture land, and make sure no one faces this crisis alone. We've done it before during droughts and hard winters. We can do it again during whatever this turns out to be." "Easy words from someone who isn't facing foreclosure," muttered a voice from the back of the room. Tom felt heat rise in his face, but before he could respond, Pete Williams spoke up again. "Tom McKenna's facing worse financial pressure than anyone in this room," Pete said firmly. "His deadline with the bank is less than 2 weeks away. If anyone has reason to take Blackwood's offer and run, it's Tom. The fact that he's willing to risk everything to investigate this situation instead tells me we should listen to what he and Miss Sullivan are saying." The revelation of Tom's desperate financial situation created a moment of shocked silence. Most of the ranchers had known he was struggling, but few had realized how close to ruin he actually was. "Is that true, Tom?" asked Bill Peterson. Tom nodded, feeling exposed, but recognizing that honesty was the only path forward. "I owe the bank $3,200 by January 15th. If I can't pay, I lose everything. Blackwood's offer would solve my immediate problem, but it would destroy any chance of rebuilding for the future." "Then why risk it?" someone called out. Tom looked at Grace, drawing strength from her steady gaze, then back at the assembled ranchers. "Because some things are more important than individual survival. Because I'd rather lose everything fighting for what's right than save myself by enabling what's wrong." The hall fell silent as men processed this declaration. Tom had laid everything on the line, admitting his desperation while simultaneously explaining why he was choosing to fight rather than accept the easy solution. "I propose we vote," Pete Williams said into the silence. "All in favor of accepting Dr. Harrison's quarantine recommendation and Mr. Blackwood's offer. Raise your hands." About a third of the hands in the room went up, mostly from ranchers whose situations were nearly as desperate as Tom's. "All in favor of postponing any quarantine and supporting Miss Sullivan's investigation. Raise your hands." More hands rose, enough to constitute a clear majority of those present. "The investigation approach wins," Pete announced. "Miss Sullivan, you've got the support of this community to find out what's really happening. How do you want to proceed?" Grace straightened her shoulders, accepting the enormous responsibility that had just been placed on her. "First, we need to secure all affected ranches to prevent further contamination. Second, we need to collect samples for chemical analysis. Third, we need to document everyone who has had access to the affected properties in the past month. And if your investigation proves that this really is a natural disease outbreak," Dr. Harrison asked, "then we'll implement appropriate medical countermeasures, and I'll personally apologize to everyone in this room for wasting their time," Grace replied, "but I don't think that's what we're going to find." As the meeting broke up, Tom noticed that Blackwood made no attempt to argue with the community's decision or to pressure individual ranchers to reconsider. Either he was accepting defeat gracefully, or he was confident that circumstances would eventually force the ranchers to come to him, regardless of what Grace's investigation revealed. Over the next 3 days, Grace worked with an intensity that amazed Tom. She collected samples from every affected ranch, documented feed and water sources, and interviewed ranch hands about anyone who had visited their properties recently. Tom provided security and transportation, but the real work was all hers. What they discovered was even more damning than Grace had expected. Chemical analysis of tissue samples revealed the presence of a specific plant toxin that didn't grow naturally in the territory. Water sources showed traces of the same compound, but only in troughs and wells that served the specific pastures where animals had become sick. Most tellingly, several ranch hands remembered seeing the same man asking questions about feed storage and water systems at multiple ranches over the past month. The man's description matched one of Blackwood's associates, a detail that Pete Williams uncovered when he made discreet inquiries about Blackwood's business operations. The conspiracy was real, systematic, and designed to destroy the ranching community for Blackwood's profit. Armed with this evidence, the community demanded that the territorial marshal investigate Blackwood and his associates. The investigation revealed a pattern of similar operations in other territories, always following the same model: create a crisis that forced desperate sellers, then acquire valuable land at bargain prices. Blackwood and his associates were arrested and charged with conspiracy, fraud, and deliberate destruction of livestock. The ranchers whose cattle had been poisoned received compensation from the seizure of Blackwood's assets, and the territorial government implemented new regulations to prevent similar schemes in the future. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the community viewed Grace Sullivan. The woman who had arrived as a desperate refugee from prejudice and cruelty had become the territory's most respected veterinarian, sought out by ranchers throughout the region for her skill and integrity. On a clear morning in early February, Tom stood in his barn, watching Grace check on Hope, who had grown into a healthy, thriving calf. The financial crisis that had threatened to destroy Pine Ridge Ranch had been resolved through the compensation received from Blackwood's seized assets, and Tom's future looked brighter than it had in years. "Grace," Tom said quietly, watching her gentle hands as she examined Hope's growth and development. "Yes," she replied, not looking up from her work. "I've been thinking about what you said that first night, about finding somewhere you could be useful and valued." "I remember. I was wondering if you'd found that place." Grace looked up then, her brown eyes bright with the keen hint of someone who had discovered their true calling. "I believe I have. And I was wondering," Tom continued, his heart beating faster than it had in years, "if you might be interested in making that place permanent, as my partner in the ranch and as my wife." Grace stared at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through surprise, joy, and something that might have been gratitude for being valued for exactly who she was. "Yes," she said simply, "I'd like that very much." As Tom took Grace in his arms, with Hope bleating contentedly nearby and the Wyoming sun streaming through the barn windows, he reflected on how completely his life had changed in the space of a few weeks. The woman who had sought shelter from a blizzard had become his salvation, his partner, and his future. Back in his chair by the fireplace in 1927, old Tom McKenna finished his story and looked at his grandson's wide eyes. "And that's how your grandmother saved Christmas, our ranch, and pretty much the entire territory," Tom said with satisfaction. "Did she ever regret choosing you over someone more handsome?" Billy asked with the innocent directness of youth. Tom chuckled, his weathered hand reaching out to touch the photograph on the mantelpiece. "Your grandmother always said she chose the man who saw her heart instead of her appearance, and who was brave enough to let her use all the gifts God had given her." "What happened to the calf, to Hope?" "Hope lived for 18 years and had more calves than we could count. Started the finest bloodline in 3 states. Your grandmother always said Hope was proof that sometimes salvation comes in the smallest packages, if you're willing to fight for it." Billy sat quietly for a moment, processing the story and its implications. "Grandpa Tom?" "Yes, boy?" "I think I understand now why you keep Grandma Grace's picture by the fire." Tom smiled, his eye bright with memory and enduring love. "She brought light into dark places, Billy. That's what good people do. They show up when you need them most, usually when you least expect them, and they remind you that miracles are possible if you're brave enough to believe in them." Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the warm house, a story of love, courage, and the power of seeing people for who they really are had been passed from one generation to the next, ensuring that Grace Sullivan McKenna's legacy would live on long after the winter storms had passed.